very much. I appreciate the help there. And if anybody does have any technical difficulties at any point, please do just let us know in that chat box over there to the right. And our wonderful colleagues at LSI will jump in to help you out. As we just heard, all lines are on mute, and we will be taking questions through that chat pod. As many of you already know, and I've already seen you do, I like to get people warmed up to use that chat pod by saying the name of their organization and the city and state that they're joining from. If you've already taken us up on that invitation, that is fine. Thanks for sharing that. It was great to see them all come in. If you haven't already, you can go ahead and do that now. Just go ahead and share the name of your organization and the city and state that you're joining in that chat box. Okay, like I said, that is how we'll take questions here today. Just as a point of reference, I do like to take them at particular times in the webinar, so you can leave a question in there at any time, but you might just need to be a little bit patient for us to pick it up. And that's going to be particularly true today, as we'll learn when we start to go through some of the content. One other little caveat about questions, because this is a competitive process, there are a handful of questions that I won't be able to answer. In particular, if I just don't have the answer handy, if I just don't know the information offhand, or if your particular question is particularly specific or requires a lot of context and a lot of discussion, we won't be able to address that here today because we want to make sure that everybody gets all the information that they need. If that's the case, you can send your question to 2020RSVP@cns.gov, and don't worry, you don't need to remember that, because if you look at that Senior Corps resource links box down to the bottom right of your screen, all the way down at the bottom there, you'll see something that says questions, and you can click that to go to the to get the URL up there. I'm also just going to drop into the chat box here so that we have it, 2020RSVP@cns.gov. There's another kind of question that none of us can ask, not even my colleagues who man that mailbox, and that's because this is a competitive process. We can't provide individual coaching or assistance. So unfortunately, I can't tell you what to put in your application. I can help you understand the requirements, understand the rules, understand the tools that you have available to you, but it's going to be up to all of you to put together your best application for this process. Okay, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and dive into some of our content. The webinar today is going to be really divided up into 3 sections. We're going to provide just a little bit of information about the process as a whole, and then we're going to spend most of our time walking through one particularly important document called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And that's why we have called this webinar a guided tour of that document. And the third component, of course, is going to be making sure that we pick up any questions that you may have. So you should see some changes on your screen right now. As many of you probably know, this is one of a series of webinars. It will be repeated on September 5th. And we know that we can't provide you all the information you need in any one setting. And that's why we have multiple opportunities to learn. So if we haven't answered your question here, if we don't answer your question here today, feel free to come on back for other opportunities. You can register for all of these and get connection information at that link down there. That's also where we'll put the recordings of these calls. All of the calls are recorded, again, as we already heard, and you can view them there. It does take a few business days from the date of a webinar to get those up. So you'll probably want to come back and check next week for the ones that we're doing this week. Finally, before we really get into the content, we want to know a little bit more about all of you. And if I could ask my LSI colleagues to go ahead and bring our first poll onto the screen right now so we can see who is here in the audience. All right, let's see who has received a federal grant before, including one from CNCS. Give that a minute to fill up. All right, it looks like the vast majority of folks here have received a federal grant before. That's good. That means that a lot of the parts of this process will be familiar to you. LSI, let's go ahead and get the next poll up there. Okay, what about Senior Corps specifically? How well do you know Senior Corps specifically? Are you brand new to all of this, or are you a current CNCS grantee? It's interesting to see with the breakdown we've got so far. We've got a lot of folks who have received prior federal grants, but are new to the world of Senior Corps. And that is great. It is one of my distinct privileges and honors to be able to welcome you to the National Service community. It's also another privilege and an honor to thank all of you who have been parts of the Senior Corps community for so long, for building up this network of volunteer organizations all across the country. It's always a pleasure to be able to participate in this process, to make new partners, or reaffirm our partnerships with some outstanding organizations. Let's go ahead and get the next poll up there if we could, LSI team. The national service community is very diverse, and we see some of that diversity on the screen right now. Go ahead and let us know what you would say the primary field of your organization is. And we know that many organizations, most organizations perhaps, will fall into more than one of these categories, but just go ahead and pick the one that you think best describes you, just to give us a sense, again, of the community that we've got. Okay, like I said, a pretty good mix. It looks like aging is the top vote getter so far, and that's pretty common. We see that, but with volunteerism and community development and something else all close on its heels. Really, really interesting to see that diversity. All right, LSI team, I'm actually going to go ahead and say, let's skip question number 4 and jump right to question number 5. Have you attended any of our other webinars? If we could go ahead and pull that one up there. Okay, let's see. We did have one other webinar in this series yesterday. Let's see who was able to attend that. All right, it looks like most of you were. That's wonderful. However, about a third of you were not. I do just want to say we're not going to cover everything we covered in yesterday's webinar today. We're going to focus in particular on the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So make sure to check back for the recording of yesterday's webinar. I would say again next week on that RSVP competition homepage, so you can get all the information that you might have missed. Of course, you're also welcome to come on back for the second presentation of that live session. Okay. Let's go ahead and get the poll out of there, and we will continue on. All right. As I said, we'll be covering 3 major topics. We're going to do a quick overview of some competition basics, get everybody on the same page, and then we'll spend most of our time walking through the Notice of Funding Opportunity before a recap and some questions. So, what is going on now? What are you all here to learn about? And apologies to those of you who were able to attend yesterday. This will be a bit of a refresher for you, but that's okay. We want to make sure everybody's got the same baseline. The Corporation for National Community Service, the federal agency where I work and that sponsors the RSVP program, is now accepting applications for the RSVP program. That is a program for volunteers 55 and older. Applications are due by 5 p.m. Eastern Time on September 25th. We have an optional notice of intent to apply process. Those are due on August 30th. Again, that is optional, but it helps us plan ahead to know what we're about to receive. Specific geographic areas are available to be served, and the way this works is laid out in a document called Appendix A to the Notice of Funding Opportunity. By the way, in case I haven't said this explicitly before, if you go back to that Senior Core Resource links box, the bottom right of your page, you'll see a link there to the 2020 RSVP competition homepage. Sometimes I call that the headquarters. All of the resources and the documents that I'm talking about here today will be on that page. So when I say Appendix A, guess where Appendix A is? On that page. And Appendix A is really important, probably the second most important document, because it explains how we have 3 things tied together for applications. So when you apply for an RSVP grant, you're actually kind of applying for a package. It is to serve a particular geographic service area for a maximum amount of funding. There's a certain amount of funding available for that geographic service area. And in that application, you also need to commit to recruiting and managing a certain number, a minimum number of unduplicated volunteers. So if you go and look at Appendix A, you'll see something like this. This is a little bit simplified. I pulled out a couple of the columns to just get it on one screen. But by and large, this is what you'll actually see. And this is the actual first opportunity that you would see in Appendix A. We're not picking on Alabama. It just happens to be first in the alphabet. And this happens to be the first opportunity in there. So all the opportunities have what's called an opportunity number based on the state, so AL08, Alabama, and then you see that funding amount. So that is the amount available to serve the geographic service area that you see over to the far right, in this case those 3 counties. You cannot request more funding than that to serve that specific geographic service area. In addition, when you submit that application, you need to have at least the number of unduplicated volunteers specified in your application, right? So those three things, so the funding amount, the number of unduplicated volunteers, and the areas affected. That's a package deal, and they all go together, and that is what you are applying for. Overall, when you look at Appendix A, you will see 228 opportunities in 45 different states, so a really, really wide distribution of opportunities. For those of you who maybe are hoping to serve an area that is not in Appendix A, do you know that we have a competition like this spread out over 3 years? So we did one cycle last year with certain geographic service areas. We're doing a second cycle this year with other geographic service areas, and we'll have a third one next year with other geographic service areas. So if you don't see the area you want to serve, go ahead and come on back next year. Keep your eyes open for this process. Or you can also use one of the resources that you will see in that Senior Corps resource links called National Service in Your State to catch up on what is going on in your state right now. A great way to get involved with Senior Corps and RSVP if you can't apply for a grant is to look for a partnership with an already existing organization. Now, what we're going to be doing is really focusing on this document called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. It has a lot of the key information about your application, and that is where we are going to spend most of the rest of the webinar. It's not the only tool, but it is a very important tool. You will find it on the RSVP competition homepage, as you would expect, right there. And in just a minute, I'm going to pull that up and take a look, and we'll walk through it together and look at some highlights. But I'm going to pause for just a second before I do that and take a couple of the questions that I've already seen come in. So Kate asks, does RSVP provide support with recruiting? For example, sending us contact info for past, current RSVP volunteers in the geographic service area. So Kate, there's a few different questions kind of bound up in that. We at Senior Corps do hope to provide our grantees with support for recruitment. That can take a lot of different forms. So for example, we have certain brochures that are available to you. We provide certain marketing products. We are hoping to launch an online tool soon to help point people in your community to you. Now, when it comes to contact info, that may or may not be possible depending on the specific situation, right? So if there's no RSVP grantee in the particular service area, well, we won't have that contact information to share. And even if there is, you can imagine that that can get a little bit more complicated. So we might be able to help in some ways, but can't necessarily commit to specific contact information. And Denise, this is related to your question too, right? So some service areas will have an existing pool of RSVP grantees because there is what we call an incumbent. There's probably many of them here on the line with us. In other areas, there won't be any, right? And it'll be up to a new organization to build that out. Let's see, Anthony says, if it says in our area is 218 volunteers, does that mean we have to commit to a minimum of 218? Yes, Anthony, that is correct. That is a minimum amount. So you can have more than that, but as a minimum amount of unduplicated volunteers. Blake asks, if there are no applications or funded programs from our geographic service area this round, will it reappear in one of the next 2 rounds? Blake, that is a really good question, and it actually kind of depends. I can't really speak to what might happen in the future. One of the things it depends on is congressional appropriation. So I don't actually have a solid answer for that, but I would encourage you, if you're curious, to come back next year and see what we have. Also, of course, at the end of this process, and we'll see when, it's in early March, we will announce the results. So that's another way to stay informed. Kate asked, so then how do we find out whether there is an existing RSVP program in our area? Well, Kate, I am glad you asked that. If we go back to the Senior Corps resource links and we look at national service in your state close to the bottom there, that takes you to an area where we have information on all of the national service programs in your state right now. That includes existing RSVP programs, but it also includes many, many other programs that you can get to know. So follow that link there, follow it to your state. A tip is, if you look to the right of the screen that you see there, and if we have some extra time at the end of the webinar, maybe we can even look at it together, you can see a detailed report, and that's probably what you're going to be looking for, a detailed report that lists all of the projects in your state. Okay, I know we've got a couple other questions. Excuse me. But I want to make sure that we get to our main topic here for today, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So I'm going to hold, Jenna and Dawn, thanks for your questions. They're good questions. We will get to them, but I'm going to hold them for right now so we can step forward just a little bit, and then we'll be able to pick those up at the end. Okay. So you'll see some changes on your screen while I go ahead and pull up the Notice of Funding Opportunity. This key document, it's kind of the equivalent of what is often called a request for proposals in other contexts or request for applications. We call it a Notice of Funding Opportunity. Hang on one second. I actually pulled up the wrong document at first. Sorry, let me switch that out real quick. Here we go. Okay. So I am here in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And the most important thing I will probably say today is this little guided tour is not a substitute for reading the entire Notice of Funding Opportunity and reviewing the other associated documents in depth. I am only going to spotlight a few specific things that I think is helpful to look out for. However, if you intend to apply and you want to have a competitive application, I cannot stress this enough. You must read the Notice of Funding Opportunity in full and the other supporting documents that you will find on that homepage. So at the end of this webinar, I'll be asking you a handful of review questions, but I'm actually going to ask you one right now, and I hope you will all just jump into the chat and answer this question. If you attend this webinar, does that mean you do not have to read the Notice of Funding Opportunity? Does attending this webinar get you out of reading the full Notice of Funding Opportunity? Go ahead and let me know in the chat. All right, good. I see everybody jumping in and saying no. I do appreciate that. Thanks for bearing with me and for being a little bit silly, but I want to make sure that that is really 100% clear. I want everybody here to have the best chance of success, and that's how you will have the best chance of success. Okay. So your version, the version that you get on the homepage, will not have these highlights. That's something that I did to help us as we talk through here. As you can see right at the top, the first thing I've highlighted are the important dates. We already talked about these, but I don't think they can be stressed enough. Note the optional notification of intent to apply, due Friday, August 30th, 2019 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Applications are due Wednesday, September 25th, 2019 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I like to highlight that Eastern Time in particular too. I work out of Central Time. I work out of the Chicago metropolitan area. That means I got to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to make sure this works, right? So wherever you are, you need to convert that to your time zone to be sure. However, as I'll stress a couple times during the course of this webinar, none of you should be submitting your application minutes before the application deadline, right? That is not a recipe for success. We strongly encourage you to submit your application well in advance. So do note that time zone, but you should not be waiting until the final minute to submit your applications. And we hope to notify successful applicants by early March 2020. Okay. As we get into the notice, we provide some background information about RSVP in general. If you want to learn more about this background information, we provided some of that in yesterday's webinar, and we'll provide some more of it in tomorrow's webinar. The first thing that I want to highlight here are CNCS's 6 key focus areas and the key goal of capacity building. Let's take a look at these focus areas. Disaster services, economic opportunity, education, environmental stewardship, healthy futures, veterans and military families. And then capacity building is not technically a focus area for rather technical reasons. Our authorizing legislation established specific focus areas, and capacity building is not one of them, but we often group them together. Applications must have some activity in one of these focus areas. If you want to learn more about what makes them up, you can do that right here. But our authorizing legislation, actually it was a reauthorization, Serve America Act, says that CNCS needs to fund programs that have some activity, not all your activity, some activity in these 6 focus areas. And as you'll see, they're pretty broad, and we don't find many organizations that have trouble finding something to do within these 6 focus areas. Now, I also like to specifically differentiate these from, to jump down here, the funding priorities. These are a little bit different. So I'm going to read directly from this for just a second. Applicants are required to address one or more of the focus areas above. We already discussed that. CNCS will not consider applications that do not address any of the focus areas, right? So you've got to include some activity within those 6. However, in addition to the focus areas, and when we're talking about funding priorities, we're talking about in addition to the focus areas, CNCS is particularly interested in supporting applications that propose to include one or more of these priorities. And as you'll see, these priorities sometimes overlap with our focus areas, but are often more specific. So within Healthy Futures, we're looking at access to care and opioid abuse. Within education, we're looking at intergenerational programming. In other cases, there is a one-to-one correspondence. Now, these funding priorities are not required. They are not required. However, we are particularly interested in supporting applications that address them. As we go through this document, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the selection process, and that's where these come in. So these are not requirements. However, they are particular priorities. And in most cases, you'll see that they're subdivisions or subcategories of these focus areas up here. Right? So I like to really draw that distinction between the two. Okay, we're going to keep on going now, and I'm just going to go through this linearly. If you have a copy printed out on your desk, feel free to follow along. You can navigate to it using those resource links and follow along by yourself. I'm going to jump here to national performance measures. So we require all of our grantees, and when I say we, that's CNCS, and when I say all of our grantees, that's all of our grantees all across the country in any program, to measure their performance using this set of national performance measures. It's a menu of output and outcome measures you use to measure your activity and your impact. However, in the world of RSVP, not all of your activity actually has to be put into national performance measures. You have to do two things. One, you have to serve, or you have to manage, as I already discussed, at a minimum, the total number of unduplicated volunteers listed in Appendix A. So that goes back to that question we had earlier about the 218 number, right? When you see Appendix A, that number of unduplicated volunteers is the total number of unduplicated volunteers you need to recruit and manage in that service area. However, there's an additional requirement. For every $1,000 in annual base federal funding, at least one unduplicated RSVP volunteer must be placed in work plans that result in national performance measure outcomes. So what that means is we may have within that total number of unduplicated volunteers a smaller number of unduplicated volunteers that must be included in these national performance measures. The others you can include in something we call other community priorities, and that just means that we don't need you to measure their performance. But for every $1,000 in annual base federal funding, we need these volunteers programmed into performance measures so we can get a sense of the impact that they are having. And that should make sense because this is a federal program, right? You all are our bosses as the American people through your elected representatives in Congress who authorize the funding for this program, of course, want to know the impact that this program is having, right? And this is one of the ways that we do that. So we're just going to talk about this for just a minute here, right, in this webinar. We unfortunately don't have time to go through examples about this particular requirement. However, that's just in this webinar. As you may have seen when we looked at the webinar schedule, we'll have another one that focuses just on performance measurement. In addition, we'll talk about this a little bit in tomorrow's webinar too, and we even did at least one example in yesterday's webinar. So we're not really going to focus on this here today. I know it can be a little bit complicated, a little bit intimidating, but we're not going to focus on it here today. Look to our other webinars to really get a deep dive in this particular topic. Okay, when I'm in this document here, actually, as it turns out, I can't see the chat. So I'm going to take a look and see if we have any questions about anything that we've gone over so far. If I do think we're going to address one of them later in this document, I might hold it. But hang on just one second while I check the questions. Okay, looking at some of the questions that we've got here. Sylvia asks, will the survey submitted on SurveyMonkey replace the notification of intent to apply? So Sylvia, where is the notification of intent to apply link? I'm going to find it in here. Great. So this is the notification of intent to apply. It is a SurveyMonkey survey. They're the same thing. So that is the notification of intent to apply. Allison asks, as you said, capacity building is not a focus area, correct? Can it be an objective? Yes, Allison, capacity building is an objective, is an allowable objective. Hester asks, presumably if an organization commits to the total number of volunteers for an area, CNCS will only select one organization for each area. Hester, that's correct. We're going to look at the FAQ document in a little bit, but in the FAQ document, we will see a question that addresses that specifically, that explains how this works. So you must apply for the total number of unduplicated volunteers there. And let me read it to you. Actually, I'm going to read it out loud. It says FAQ 8.5, will an opportunity be awarded to just one organization, or can it be split between multiple awards? And the answer to that is each opportunity is awarded to only one organization. Opportunities are not split between multiple awardees. So that's in the FAQs that you can find on the same page as this document. Okay, thanks for those questions. We're going to go ahead and get back to our document here. All right, it's a little bit higher up. Okay, so we talked about this. Let's go on a little bit forward. Now we have the total amount of funding that we expect to give approximately, but remember, that does not mean that any one opportunity can apply for that, right? You're going to be applying for the maximum amount in the notification, or sorry, in Appendix A, This also describes our project period. We generally make 3-year grant awards. We make an initial award for the first year of operation based on a 1-year project period, and that comes with funding. Continuation awards for subsequent years depend on the availability of appropriations and satisfactory performance and are not guaranteed. So what that means is we'll make an award for 3 years with funding for the first year, and then funding for the second and third year are based on the availability of appropriations. In other words, whether the U.S. Congress, as approved by the President, says, yes, CNCS, yes, RSVP, you may continue doing what you are doing, and satisfactory performance. Right? So looking at a 3-year project period with individual grant years within that. Going to continue going on down. Matching. I'm going to read this out loud, and then we're going to jump down to this incumbent-only thing that you see just below it. Applicants are required to partially match funds for their projects through local non-federal contributions. The required local contribution in year 1 of the grant is at least 10% of the total project budget. The required portion is at least 20% in year 2, and at least 30% in year 3 and subsequent years if the grant is renewed beyond 3 years. So you've got the sliding scale, starting at 10% of the total project budget required to be matched, then 20%, and then 30%. But if you are an incumbent, right, that's the word that we use for someone who already has an RSVP grant and is already serving a particular service area, you've already gone through that sliding scale. You've already moved up it. And so incumbents are required to budget and raise at least 30% of the total project budget from the beginning. So if your organization already has an RSVP grant and you're applying for that same service area, you're going to come in at this 30% level. Potential new organizations have the opportunity to scale up over their first 3 years. Let's continue on. Okay, a very, very important part of the application. One of the most common questions that I get is, what should I include in my application? It's a very good question. In a prior life, when I was putting together grant applications myself, it's something I focused on, of course. We have the outline here, right? It explains the different portions. Now, the application is actually going to be submitted in an electronic grants management system called eGrants. And what you'll see when you get an eGrant is it has specific, what we call modules, specific sections, specific programming for each of these sections. So you're not going to be submitting to us one big long Word document with all of this information. Instead, you're going to be putting that into the electronic grants management system. And we'll look at how we recommend doing that in just a minute, because we don't recommend just getting started in eGrants and putting all that information in eGrants. eGrants is a particular piece of software, and like any piece of software, it has its flaws. So we'll look at the strategy that we recommend using to build your application in just a minute. We do have a page limit, 15 double-spaced pages, as the pages print out from eGrants. So when you're almost done, you're going to want to print out your application and review it to make sure it's within the page limit. Okay, here on the top of page 8, we have a little administrative step that actually can trip up some applicants. This is something that's common, I think, to, I don't want to say all, but I think most federal grant programs. You need to register if you want to apply in these free systems. So this is free. It is free to do this, but you must have an active registration. That helps the federal government make sure that you're not doing bad things, right? That you haven't been caught, doing something with your funds that you're not supposed to be doing. So you have to register and you have to renew it annually. So if you don't know your status or the status of your organization, go ahead and talk to your colleagues right now to check that if you plan to apply. It is very easy to do, it is not a very long process, and it is free. So you don't want to miss it and you don't want to leave it to the end because it could trip you up. So make sure you don't miss this administrative step. We have, of course, already talked about the submission dates and times, but you can't talk about that too much. Wednesday, September 25th, 2019 by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. But of course, you all will be submitting your applications well in advance of that, I am sure. We're going to continue on. Now, I am not highlighting anything here, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It just means we've got limited time. So please make sure you read this document in full. Excuse me. Now, I mentioned our electronic grants management system. I'm going to read this section out loud as well. CNCS recommends that applicants create an account and begin the application at least 3 weeks before the deadline. Applicants are recommended to draft the application as a Word document, then copy and paste the text into the appropriate fields in eGrants no later than 10 days before the deadline to ensure sufficient time to make corrections or address any potential technical issues. Should you run into any of those technical issues, we also have a hotline and a web form that you can use for assistance. But the key is to give yourself time, right? We don't want to be at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on September 25th working with these issues because guess what? Someone else might need to too, and there is limited capacity here. So please, 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 first draft your application as a Word document and then move it over into eGrants, our electronic grants management system, when you are ready to apply. And please, 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 don't wait until the deadline to do that. Do it at least 10 days before the deadline, right? You have all the information you need to get started right now. You might be wanting to attend some of our trainings, and that is great. We hope you come, but don't wait for that to get started. Get started as soon as you can. So use your Word documents to draft the application. And then we're also going to spotlight one tool a little bit later on that will help you particularly draft your national performance measures, which is another portion of the electronic grants management system. Okay. We're going to jump on down here to one of the most important parts of this document. In addition to what should be included in the application, I'm sure many of you all also want to know what determines what applications will get funded. This determines what applications will get funded. We have specific evaluation criteria spelled out here and weighted. So here are the weights, and if you go down just a little bit, we tell you what we are looking for in applications. So, do your narratives and work plans describe and demonstrate a community need? Do they articulate a theory of change? Do they, let's jump on down here to recruitment and development of volunteers, right? So we're also looking for your plan and infrastructure to ensure RSVP volunteers receive training needed to succeed in the service activities described in the work plan. These criteria are what we will be using, what CNCS uses, to determine the most competitive applications. So this is where you want to really be focusing when you are developing your application because it's what our reviewers will be noticing. I'm going to jump down a little bit here to the application review. Panels of reviewers, including some external, some individuals who are external to our agency, some people who are within our agency, and maybe some people who are in other federal roles, will assess applications based on the criteria above. And that is how we determine the most competitive applications, right? That is how we determine the most competitive applications. So you're going to want to spend a lot of time focusing on these criteria and making sure that your application is responsive to them. We want you all to put your best foot forward, and this is what our reviewers will be using to determine which applications are the most competitive. Okay, we've got just a couple of other things to go through here, so I'm going to keep going, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up some questions as we get towards the end of the document. As I've already mentioned, CNCS anticipates announcing the results of this competition by early March 2020, contingent on the availability of congressional appropriations. And because we are a federal program, these grants come with a certain set of rules and regulations that guide them. Right? When you accept funds from the federal government, you also accept the rules that come with them, right? You agree to abide by a certain set of rules that helps us all steward taxpayer funds well. And you'll see those spelled out here, including with links. So you're going to want to become familiar with these, because if you do receive a grant, you're going to be held accountable to them. This is us telling you our expectations of you when you receive a grant, or if you receive a grant. So make sure you review these. As I know, many of you have other federal awards or have experience with other federal awards, so you should be familiar with the Uniform Guidance, which governs how grant funds can be spent across the entire federal government. But of course, we've got our own terms and conditions here that are specific to CNCS grants. And we also want to highlight this specific requirement to conduct national service criminal history checks. In the context of the RSVP program, this is a process that applies to all staff who will be on your grant. It applies to staff who are on the grant. And there's a lot of information here, and in addition, there are links to further resources. One thing that's new this year is, well, actually, sorry, not one thing that is new, although it is partially new, but one thing I would like to highlight is that the cost of conducting these is an allowable expense under the awards. You want to make sure that you budget for it, and in particular, grantees, there's this line here, grantees should utilize 2 vendors CNCS has engaged to conduct the required NACHCs, and you can learn more about them using this link so you can budget appropriately. Make sure you include them in your budget. Okay, I think that is all I highlighted in here, except, of course, this email address, which we've already discussed. We have limited time here. I'm going to go and start answering all the questions that I can, but trust me when I say I will not be able to answer every question that you have here today. We have other training opportunities, but please, please, please also be aware of this resource that you can use to get more hands-on assistance if we're not able to answer your question. So give me 1 second while I go on back and start answering some questions. Okay, I'm going to pick up the questions where we left off here, and it looks like the first one that I forgot I had a couple of questions that came in early that I did not answer. So I'm going to jump up to Jana and Don's question. Jana asked, does the number of unduplicated volunteers refer to the number we already have working with us, or the number of senior corps volunteers we would host? So, Jana, it could be a little bit between those things, but I think more the second one, right? It's the number of specific RSVP volunteers that you will have and manage. Now, as you'll see in our FAQs, you can take volunteers that you're already managing and create and turn them into RSVP volunteers. They just need to go through a certain eligibility process. They are then entitled to certain benefits. But if you turn them into RSVP volunteers, well, then they're RSVP volunteers, and that counts as an unduplicated volunteer. I also saw a question that came in a little bit later. I'm going to answer it right now, which is, do they need to be new every year? And the answer is no. So if the number that you see in Appendix A for your area is 100, that does not mean that in year 1 you need to recruit 100 people, and in year 2 you need to recruit a new 100 people. That is not how it works. They can be the same 100 people. The idea is at any one time within your grant, you have that number of unduplicated volunteers. You don't need to keep multiplying it every year. In the same token, this is a question I saw a little bit later on too, but the dollar amount is an annual amount. So you receive that amount for your first year, right, the first year, and then you'll receive that same amount for the second year. So if let's say it's listed at $100,000, year 1 you'd get $100,000, and then subject to appropriations and performance in year 2, you would get $100,000. Okay. Don asks, what happens if we do not get the minimum amount of volunteers required? And Don, it's a good question, but unfortunately I can't actually answer it categorically. It depends a lot on the specific circumstances. So you can imagine one scenario where a grantee receives funds, but they don't really make a good faith effort to execute the program. And let's say they're supposed to have 100 unduplicated volunteers and they only have one. And you can imagine another scenario where there's an organization that is working very hard and does everything right and only has 99. Well, those are two very, very different situations. What I can say is that we evaluate success at the end of that 3-year project period. So that's when we really take a good hard look at what has been achieved, the end of the 3-year project period. Now, in between, you're going to have communication with GNCS program officers. We're going to be working with you and helping you achieve your goals. But that, at the end of the year 3, is when we really, really take a good hard look at performance. Okay, let's jump down to some of these other questions that we've got. I believe I've already answered Denise's question about Appendix A. Dawn's question, I believe I've already answered that. Robert asks, DUNS does not need to be renewed yearly, though SAM does. So what I am actually going to do for that question is I'm going to go right back to the Notice of Funding Opportunity itself. And I recommend you all do this as well. Okay. So I'm reading now from page 8 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Applications must include a DUNS number and an employer identification number. That's your taxpayer identification number. The DUNS number does not replace that number. Applicants can obtain a DUNS number at no cost by calling the request line. We recommend registering at least 30 days before the application due date. After obtaining a DUNS number, all applicants must register with the System for Award Management and maintain an active SAM registration. If an applicant is awarded a grant, it must maintain an active SAM registration throughout the life of the award. SAM registration must be renewed annually. So the way that reads is I believe you only receive your DUNS number once, but then you need to maintain an active SAM registration annually. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Lisa asks, do current grantors create a new application or continuation renewal? Lisa, the answer is new, and that is also in our FAQs. Shauna asks, background checks on volunteers as well as employees paid by grants. So, Shauna, what we are talking about here with this national, I want to be very clear, this required process of national service criminal history checks is only applicable in the RSVP program to staff. What you do for volunteers, of course, will depend on your specific organization and the organizations that you are working with. If I'm not answering a question, please send an email to 2020rsvp@cns.gov. Patty asks, if you are a current grantee and accepted augmentation funding and rechecked all employee backgrounds, do we need to redo them again, same staff and new applications? So Patty's question is about the specific National Service Criminal History Check requirement. And if you are an incumbent, which means if you have already received RSVP funds, an individual only needs to be checked once through that process. However, if you are applying for the first time, you're going to need to check people one time. But once you do that, that check stands unless an individual leaves the organization. And even then, there's some more technicalities you can learn more about when you get into this world that may allow that check to stand, even if they leave and come back or go on a pause. But we're not going to address that now. In general, one-time check as long as they don't leave. If you need more information about that, please use the resources that you see in the Notice of Funding Opportunity or shoot us an email. Allison asks, is this funding only competitive or on any continuation applications or non-competitive admin renewals this year? So Allison, we are here talking about a specific competitive process, right, and the opportunities that are going through this competitive process. But as I already mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the call, we actually divide up the competitions across 3 years. So last year we had a number of service areas go through competition, and this year they would be going through what we call here at CNCS a continuation, right? Going through that process of just making sure there are appropriations and satisfactory performance for a second year of funding. So there are other RSVP grantees and other service areas that are going through that process right now. Denise asks, what is the deadline for recruiting the total number of unduplicated volunteers listed in Appendix A? Again, we take a good hard look at performance at the end of year 3 of the grant. Jen asks, how frequently do RSVP volunteers tend to volunteer? What does the eligibility process for making a current volunteer an RSVP volunteer look like? So Jenna, I'll take those one at a time. So the first question is a really good one, but actually I can't answer it because it really, really varies. It really, really depends on a specific community and their need and a specific organization and how it chooses to manage these volunteers. There are RSVP volunteers out there who volunteer relatively infrequently, maybe a couple hours a month. There are other RSVP volunteers out there who volunteer for a set number of hours every week. It really is going to be up to all of you to determine what works best for your community. What does the eligibility process for making a current volunteer an RSVP volunteer look like? It's actually not all that complicated. The only real requirement for an RSVP volunteer is that they have to be 55 and older. If they're 55 and older, they can be an RSVP volunteer. What I will actually do is I'm going to drop another link into the chat box here for what we call the Managing Senior Corps Grants page. And on that page, you will see the operational resources that are available to current RSVP volunteers. And there's a handbook there. You're going to want to look at the RSVP handbook, which will spell out exactly how current RSVP organizations recruit and check the eligibility of volunteers. Marianne asks, is the financial management survey new? Does an incumbent need to send in IRS returns? The financial management survey has been around for a while. In terms of the specific documents that are required, I'm going to have to point you back to the Notice of Funding Opportunity and some of the other tools that we'll look at in just a second. Jenna also asks, how do organizations typically go about recruiting RSVP volunteers? And Jenna, I got to say again, it really, really varies on the community. In some communities, there are pools of seniors who will congregate around, let's say, places of worship or coffee houses. In others, an online approach might be more relevant. We unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. There's no one way to do it. It really is about what is right for your community. So sorry, Jana, I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer there. Now, as we're getting down towards the end of the webinar, I've mentioned a few other tools, and I do want to take a second to highlight some of them. These are all available at that same page that you will find down in the Senior Corps Resource Link, the 2020 RSVP competition page. And I try to grab my pointer here. My pointer's not cooperating, so sorry about that. I'm going to... Oh, there's my pointer. Okay. So, the first resource that I want to point to are the grant application instructions. I've mentioned a few different times our electronic grants management system, eGrants. These grant application instructions give you step-by-step, click-by-click guidance on how to navigate that system. They also include some information about things like required documents. So that's a really great resource for that question about the financial management survey. We've already talked a fair amount about Appendix A. That is the available service areas and the funding amounts and minimum volunteers associated with them. And these next two resources are really, really important for performance measurement. Appendix B lists out all of our national performance measures and gives some information about how you will use them. Right? There's a menu of output and outcome measures that you will select from. And these work plan development worksheets are really, really helpful because they help you plot out how you will use them in our electronic grants management system. I mentioned that that system, eGrants, is made up of these discrete modules. Well, one of the modules is about national performance measures. And you'll see it asks you to program and plan in a certain way and provide certain information about your projected outcome amounts and the community need. And it asks for that in a specific format. And it can be very, very difficult to build those within eGrants. Again, it's a piece of software. It's not perfect, right? If you are trying to change things and experiment with things, it is very, very difficult to do that within the system. But these worksheets are editable Word documents that you can use to plan things out and experiment. Try programming it one way and another way so that you can make sure you're getting all of your unduplicated volunteers where you want them to be. And then finally, we have a frequently asked questions document that you all have actually heard me quote from already a few times today. You all have heard me quote from a few times today. Got a couple other things that I can show you, but I think I've answered all of the questions that I've seen in the chat box so far. If I've missed any, please remind me, and now might also be a good time to drop in another question if you haven't. Okay, not seeing any new questions come in, so what I'm going to do with our last time here is I'm going to go to the 2020 competition homepage and just show a couple of these resources in a slightly different way. You'll see some changes on your screen while I do that. Okay, we are here on the homepage, right? You can see the NOFO, the step-by-step instructions, Appendix A, our performance measure instructions, and the work plan development worksheets. I cruised over this Appendix C, but there's an Appendix C with the terms and definitions. Here's also some more information about those required documents where you can get that question about what specifically needs to be submitted. I'm also going to quickly do something that I promised to do and just check out the National Service in your state page so I can show you where to get the specific profiles that I'm talking about. Let's take the state that I am in right now, Illinois, as an example. I'm going to view the report. Now, first you see this great graphic which tells me National Service Impact in Illinois. 1,600 local service sites, 14,700 senior Corps and AmeriCorps members, $63.2 million in CNCS and local funding, and $148 million in AmeriCorps scholarships since 1994. That's wonderful. If I want that detail, though, to see who is actually working in my community, I'm going to go over here because this is what's really going to tell me what's going on in my community, and I'll go ahead and just show you this example here. So it starts, as I said, this is all of the National Service community, so it's going to start with AmeriCorps, but let's see what happens if I just do a quick search for RSVP. There you have it. There's our RSVP organization. So that's how you can do that. Okay, as our time gets low, I'm going to ask the LSI team if you wouldn't mind pulling over our 2 satisfaction survey questions onto the screen right now. We do appreciate you filling them out. Just 2 very simple, very quick questions. There is no need to click submit. All you need to do is just choose the choice and that'll automatically register it. Thank you, LSI team. Let's see if we have any other questions here. Thanks to everybody for their good feedback. I appreciate that. Also make sure you fill out the survey. That's what we really use to make sure that we're doing well here and getting you the information you need. I see Richard asked about the RSVP handbook. Denise answered that. Thank you, Denise, for getting that information. That is the correct link. Let me just see if there are any other final questions. We'll do one last call. And I'm not seeing any, so we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up just a couple minutes early here today. Please do come back for our other webinars. We've got one tomorrow, 2 next week, and then we'll be repeating all of them one more time as we move into September. Really appreciate everybody coming out and learning today, and we look forward to seeing your applications. That'll do it for us.